Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Astrology with Ethan podcast. My name is Ethan, and today we are discussing an important topic in astrology that I've been very excited to mention for some time now, which is philosophy, the philosophy of astrology. So, what our underlying understanding of this system is, how it works, why it works, the bigger questions that allow us to engage with this craft. And I think it's really important to consider, given that astrology is making such a resurgence in the culture right now, to really know for ourselves the history, the philosophy, and what we think about it. You know, what our personal approach as practitioners or as experiencers of this craft choose to fall under. So, without further ado, I'm going to tell you the history that gave birth to the ancient philosophies of astrology, and then we're going to compare this with the modern philosophy and the ongoing conversation about philosophy in the astrological field today. So, to really understand astrology as we practice it today, we have to go back to Mesopotamia in the year approximately 3000 BC. So that's almost 5,000 years ago. That we have evidence of astronomers who were also astrologers, so people who observed the stars but also sought meaning from them. That's the astrology part, right? They started to notice the skies and the fact that stars had cycles, that there were these fixed cycles that were happening in the skies. And one of the ways that they determined this was by noticing that there were stars that would be there every night, yet there would be some stars that moved. And those moving stars were the planets. And they took on this quality of the gods in Mesopotamia as the gods living up in the skies, spreading messages from up above, right, to down below. So, this ancient form of astrology that began in Mesopotamia, in short, was concerned with looking to the skies for messages or omens from the gods, rather than seeing the skies as a direct cause or effect on planetary activity here on Earth. They saw the skies more as divine poetry, which the gods in their cosmology were writing for them. And that is why, actually, if you think about it, astronomers and astrologers were motivated to study the skies, is they wanted to see what the gods had to say. That's why there was so much record keeping, in part, right? Was to uncover the meaning of these cycles that seem to be fixed into the skies. So, thousands of years later, we get the emergence of Greek philosophy. And at this time, we have, we're looking at the myths and the plays, and then eventually the philosophies that come from figures like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. And really, what's important to keep in mind about the arrival of Greek philosophy and civilization in the Mediterranean is that it is what ultimately brings together the Hellenistic astrological system that we have today. So it is through this Greek philosophy, which is more than signs and omens like the Mesopotamians, it's more concerned with causes, with ultimate reality, with the actual underlying structures of the universe, right? Think Aristotle and the four causes or the four elements. So the Greek philosophical schools really begin taking dominance in the Mediterranean around 300 BCE, when Alexander the Great, takes that Greek philosophy from the north, from Macedonia and Greece, and spreads it as he conquests the Mediterranean. So Alexander the Great, if you look at the map of his empire, brings Greek philosophy to places like Mesopotamia, to places like Egypt. He spreads it around the Mediterranean, interacting thus with the astrology of Mesopotamian people who around these years were also carrying their teachings to places like Egypt and Greece. So astrology from Mesopotamia was already sort of in the waters, right? But then it really becomes enlivened and systematized and edited upon when Greek Hellenistic philosophy enters the picture. So, where Hellenistic astrology really comes together, or the practice of astrology that most astrology we study today is based off, is actually in Egypt. So a lot of people think, oh, astrology comes from Greece or Rome. It actually, the form and style we practice today comes from Egypt. Okay. So in Alexandria, this is a city, a part of the world where, it is a hub of culture, of literature, of science, of astronomy. And also of Greek philosophy. So Greek becomes around this time the dominant language, the dominant philosophy, right? Because of the Hellenistic conquest, it becomes sort of the milieu there for 300 years, from 300 BCE to around, 1 CE. You're really entrenched with, Greek language, Greek religion, Greek philosophy. So keep in mind that the Greek philosophers were more concerned with cause than they were symbol or sign. So they're looking for causes. Now, what they're also practicing in the Greek philosophical schools at this time is Stoicism. So Stoicism is really this idea that everything that happens in life is fated. So events will happen and there are no actions you can take to prevent them. They just do. So now think about when that school of philosophy meets Mesopotamian astrology, it is sort of a perfect match of a Stoic philosophical system that says everything happens for unknown reasons that we can't control, and then having a representation of the reasons why things happen with the planets. They really map on well together. And so Mesopotamian astrology starts taking on these Stoic characteristics of, the planets being a place you can look to for the causes of events in your life. So, what is important to really analyze at this point is that when Hellenistic astrology is being formed in 300 BCE, there are sort of four different corners of its philosophies that are very important to consider. So, number one and two, I will say, are this idea of causes versus signs. This is something we've really been talking about. So, while the Mesopotamians saw the cosmos as signatures of what might happen in a person's life, in a civilization's life, the Greeks and their philosophies were more interested in causes, in natural causes. So then you have with some Hellenistic astrologers them seeing the planets as the sole causes of events. We get this confused a lot, especially in just pop culture. A lot of people assume that people who practice astrology believe that the planets cause events in life. Most of us would agree that's nonsense. I mean, I personally think it is because they're so far away, but rather they are signatures, they are omens, they are like handwriting that somehow reflects what's happening down here on Earth. And I don't mean to say if you believe they actually do cause things, it's a nonsense. I mean, my mind is very open, but personally, I'm more interested in the planets as signs than anything. But we have this divide at this point. Are the planets, are they signs of things that are going to happen, or are they actually the things causing everything to happen? Are they the ultimate underlying cause? And next, we have this question about fate versus free will. So again, Stoicism, kind of inviting more this idea of fate, inviting more this idea that, well, everything is predetermined, and the best you can do, right, is sort of cultivate a strong attitude towards these events that are happening in your life without your control. Free will more so says, or partial determinism might say, you know, you can make some adjustments. Sure, some things are fated, but you can make some adjustments, right? So, if you're curious and kind of looking into for examples of this philosophy being practiced, you could look to Vedius Valens for somebody who was a second century astrologer in Alexandria who believed in a combination of fate and sign-based astrology, meaning omens. So he didn't see the planets as causes, he rather saw them as omens or signs that fated events were going to occur. Versus if you looked at Dorotheus of Sidon, right? Dorotheus saw the philosophy of astrology through the lens of the stars and planets being signs with partial determinism attached to them. So there were still some things you could do to negotiate. And really, the king of bringing this Greek philosophy of cause to the table and standardizing astrology that way was Ptolemy, who was interested in making astrology into a natural science. So Ptolemy was more interested in looking at the planets as causes, causes of, let's say you were born with Mars in the first house or something. He would say, oh, well, Mars causes heat, right? So this person could run hot, or, this person might have anger problems, or, something like that, because he was trying to look at, okay, the qualities of the planet and then how those get imprinted on someone birth. So Ptolemy was much more aligned with the cause-based model. If anything, he kind of standardized that in the ancient world, but with partial determinism. So with, just like Dorotheus, you can change some things. Now, Firmicus, who was a Roman astrologer, saw things Ptolemy's way in terms of natural causes, but he saw it as having faded um, faded experiences attached to them. So the planets both caused and were fate, right? If that makes sense. So the planets in their positions fated you to things and caused them simultaneously. So you can see how there are sort of, the categories of fate versus free will and causes versus signs, and you can really kind of fall in any one of those four corners of the grid. Now, personally, and I'll get into my views on astrological philosophy a little bit later, I align more with Dorotheus, who believed in a sign-based model of the cosmos, so the cosmos being signs but not ultimate causes, and them also being or affecting us in a way that still allows us to have free will, so we can understand our destiny in the stars, but then we can, by understanding that, consciously make modifications to our actions to meet the stars where they are, to meet these signs right on time, which arguably people do all the time if they use electional astrology. If they are planning their life with any form of astrology, you are using something that is right, maybe partially faded or written in the stars to modify your free will and action. So to me, that's what makes the most sense. And I believe that as cosmology has expanded, as the universe has gotten so much larger, the planets in our solar system certainly cannot be the end all be all cause of why we experience the things we do, right? It could be coming from other galaxies. It could be a binary star system we're attached to. I mean, there's so many bigger causes than just our solar system that I think the planets, once again, are a microcosm of that bigger thing. They're a sign of that bigger thing, but are they that bigger thing? To me, no. They are just one level up from, our Earth, right? Signifying events on our Earth, but not causing them completely. So I digress. One of the reasons, before I say that, no, I will say that. One of the reasons that astrology falls out in the coming years, so think the fall of the Roman Empire, and the beginnings of the medieval times, and then we move into the early modern period, is because Christianity is emergent around the same period that Hellenistic astrology is being formed in Egypt. So while Greek philosophy and religion is being shared, you have sort of this massifying of civilization. You have much more ideas and philosophies being exchanged. And one of the ways that societies tolerated that at the time, tolerated that amount of diversity and discursivity, was through processes, the bringing forth of monotheism, which today we know as maybe the Abrahamic faiths, which would be Judaism, which is already, popular and alive at this time, but eventually Christianity and then later Islam. Monotheism meaning that there is sort of this singular source or God that we can rely on for, our salvation, for the meaning of our life, for the purpose of our life. So think about that already contrasting, Greek polytheism or even Hellenistic astrology, this idea that there are, right, maybe several inputs or causes rather than just one, right? Rather than just God, it is many things happening all at once. So as Christianity becomes popular during the late Hellenistic period, beginning of the first century CE, one of the doctrines in Christianity is, that you need free will to meet the demands of your God, that you need free will to be able to get into heaven, right? This fundamentally rejects really any form of astrology because even if you take the approach that it is only partially determined what happens from the cosmos to you, you're still agreeing with some level of determinism. And so as Christianity makes its way into the Roman Empire, which, is interesting because simultaneously astrology is in the Roman Empire and is very popular, Christianity begins to consume, right? And astrology begins to die and be rejected. Even Firmicus Maternus, who I mentioned earlier in regards to his philosophies, later quits astrology and becomes a Christian and actually writes an essay completely bad-mouthing astrology. So really the shift in stoicism, in the fated attitude towards life, shifts us into now a period of, absolute free will and service towards the highest, service towards God. And so astrology really becomes obsolete, but it doesn't completely go away, right? So astrology doesn't completely go away. So the Roman Empire falls. We have, the beginning of the Middle Ages, and then we have the Crusades. Now, what's very interesting about this period in Northern Western Europe is that astrology is actually flourishing in the Islamic world at this time. So while Christianity is, buzzing in the North, we have astrology and still Zoroastrianism and these different religions being practiced in the Middle East, as well as India. So there's a lot of transmission to these cultures in this time, and they are actually responsible, the Islamic astrologers, for keeping this tradition alive for so long. Because until the Crusades, does astrology become recovered from places like the Middle East and Spain, right? These European invasions of the Middle East. And back with them, they bring the, documents and the recordings and the teachings and the writings of Islamic astrologers who've preserved this, ancient Hellenistic wisdom for years, which I just find super interesting. And then we get the period, still the Middle Ages, but the Renaissance, where scholastics are bringing back Greek philosophy and Hellenistic philosophy and astrology and actually teaching it in universities. Like, I think that is the craziest thing that Middle Ages, Renaissance times, astrology was being taught in schools. Like, you could literally go to school and become an astrologer. I just think that's crazy cool. So the texts find their way back. Now, what happens though at this time is we begin getting, the Protestant Reformation, and we begin seeing the fight against organized religion. And this brings more curiosity into, Protestantism, but eventually natural theology, and science as we now know it today, which sort of grows out of religion and then becomes completely opposed to it. So before we get into sort of the Enlightenment, the early modern period, it's important to talk about how um, at this time, we are seeing people extricate themselves from organized religion. So they are becoming less and less and less enchanted, be it with Christianity or astrology. There is more of a demand for individual reason and logos to determine one's own life. So there's kind of this burgeoning quest for individuality that begins in the Protestant Reformation, right? And then really comes into bloom by the Enlightenment. So around this time, astrology is one of the things that becomes questioned and rejected and eventually really goes because we have the Copernican revolution happen, which I actually wrote an essay on in college, which really catalyzes the scientific revolution because this is where the model of a geocentric cosmos, where we have Earth at the center and everything spinning around it, gets disproven by Copernicus, by Nicholas Copernicus, who actually doesn't prove right away, but argues that the sun sits at the center of our solar system and we revolve around it. So think about what that does to not just astrology, but Christian cosmology, right? The idea that we are not the center of what God created, but we are just one kind of bit um, of a larger universe. I mean, it completely throws off our orientation in the cosmos. And arguably, I think we're still recovering from that today, where our universe just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The world seems to get more and more and more existential and more meaningless, the more that the stars around us expand. So this is a critical point where, astrology, which is built on a geocentric model, sort of gets tossed out. And nothing is right away. These are all processes, but you can see how the rise in religious questioning leads to the rise in secularism and the lack of real faith, that the Westerner carries. And into the early modern period, natural theology, which is how religious people once described science. It was all about studying nature to understand the laws of God. But once, say we go all the way up to Darwin takes that trip around the world, he realizes, oh my God, there is just too much diversity on Earth for there to be, right, a creator. Like there has to be evolution. There can't just be this creator who designed all these things. There have to be competitive species, right? And so there just becomes, this expansion in the Western mind, whereby, humans get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller in the cosmos, that the natural world appears more and more and more indifferent and we become more isolated. So I think this is a really interesting place to transition into now the modern period, where astrology, after really the 1800s, I mean, the 1800s is its lowest point in being practiced or read. But in the 1900s, we start to get a resurgence of it with, Westerners exploring different Eastern religions and philosophies. Astrology making its way back, what it shows us, or how it shows up rather, is in psychological ways. So there is an interest around this time because of, Freud and Jung and all the, incredible psychologists that come out of, the late modern period. In the way the psyche works. And so astrology, in its recovery, becomes very interesting to psychologists or psychologically inclined wisdom figures who start to look at it as, astrology, a symbolic reflection of the mind. And we begin looking at things like sun sign astrology with Alan Leo, which looks at the sun as a determiner of personality. and so on and so forth. The whole birth chart then starts to be about studying one's personality, finding oneself, understanding one's psychology. But the fundamental disconnection here is that ancient astrologers were not concerned with your psychology. They were concerned with your life, your entire life, your fate, right? It was more about what would happen to you in your life with varying understanding and how much control you had over this versus you cut to the late modern period, I was saying, and you begin to see that, we have completely, become disembodied of the greater universe and much more individualistic and much less connected or seeing ourselves as connected with the cosmos. And so the cosmos become this thing kind of outside of us, that are indifferent towards us. And astrology is engaged more as, ancient rhetoric that can be used to talk about our psyches in an interesting, individualistic way. So astrology really, when it becomes modern, becomes psychological, becomes about the individual, right? And so this has its benefits and its drawbacks, right? One of the benefits of astrology becoming more psychological is it extricates us from the Western fear, that something higher has say over your individuality, that your individuality is limited, right? So I'm not a fatalist. I'm not a total believer in absolute determinism that you can't do anything to alter your life. I think we can. But for those who are free will absolutists, I don't consider myself that. This was a tremendously unappealing philosophy of fate, and arguably it still is, and astrology's association with fate. So psychological astrology gets us away from a fated model. It allows more free will. It also, in some cases, extricates us from a cause-based model. So seeing the planets as natural causes, it turns astrology more into a symbolic language of psyche. So once again, it's still responding to the evolution of Western philosophy, which is more in the direction of individualism and more away from organized religion, belief, massification of the psyche and more towards individualization of the psyche. Now, as I'm saying the word individualism a lot, I'm sure you're picking up on there might be some flaws with this new form of astrology that grows in, the 20th century. And there certainly are. One of them is that the modernization of astrology um, does not really carry forward the fate or fortune telling that the ancient astrologers intended to provide. So that's number one. It kind of loses that connection with that original um, intent. And of course, there's a lot of debate over what different astrologers existed at this time and what their intents truly were. But within the Hellenistic system, it was really built around this kind of Stoic notion of fate. That was the dominant philosophy at the time, Stoicism, that sort of consolidated all these different astrologies into one central system. So modern astrology sort of forgets fate. The other thing I think it does is it places too much emphasis on the individual. It places, the whole chart as a reading of oneself, where in the fated model, it was a reading of one's whole life. And the reason I actually prefer the ancient way of looking at that is because this life that we're all living, I believe, does have a lot that is outside of our control. And when you make astrology purely psychological, you're also telling a person that there's a lot more in control than there might actually be. for themselves, right? You can tell somebody, they have a planet in the eighth house and that they should really invest in their own psychology more. And this person can try all day and night, to, I don't know, make their mental health problems heal. But then they're going to be disappointed when, maybe an external event brings upon a mental health issue. This is just an example using the eighth house. It's not an absolute, but it could bring on a mental health issue. And then they could feel really guilty of like, oh, I knew I had an eighth house planet. Like I should have been able to fix that. Right. So the beauty in the older ways of astrology is that it allows you to kind of release a lot of your life to fate, to a higher power. Because let's face it, we do not have as much control as we are sold to think in our highly atomized society. We are, in a lot of ways, subject to the environments we're raised in, but also the cosmos themselves. Think about what a miracle it is to be born into this universe and for us to have no connection, no authority from the cosmos or something higher, to me is just ridiculous. Of course we would. Of course there would be, you know, connections between our planet and the other planets and the ways that they all revolve and rotate around the sun, but also how we revolve and rotate around our lives. Of course, there would be that connection, but modern astrology sort of, to me, places too much onus on the individual, and it can actually make us more stressed than we would be if we just sort of accepted things were fated. But again, I like modern astrology in that it does free us from a total determinism, and it allows us to sort of test, what works for us. We don't have to fully accept astrology as a doctrine. We can sort of more modify it to be what we want it to be. So I want to bring in now I say we're living in the postmodern period, a postmodern philosopher and astrologer, Richard Tarnas, who I don't know if you guys have ever read his book, Cosmos and Psyche, but it is an incredible, very academic book actually about astrology, particularly outer planetary transits and how they affect the psyche of an individual using, dozens of years of real life research. Amazing book. But one of the ways that Tarnas breaks down his philosophy of astrology, and I really find this incredibly fascinating, is he talks about how in, the pre-ancient, pre-literate world, thousands and thousands of years ago, humans and nature were much more connected, right? We were much more rooted and grounded and humbled and what would be another word? We were so much more baked in to the natural world. It was so much more intimidating, right? If you think about it, the stars, the woods, everything was bigger than us, right? And everything being bigger than us, anything that happened to us was ultimately intertwined with all of that which was bigger, which was greater. So he sort of proposes that in, our for lack of a better term, pre-civilizational primitive, some might say, in those societies, we were one and the same with the cosmos. So our perception of what happened to us was extended to everything around us. Anything that happened to us was because it was happening around us. We were sort of like empty vessels through which the paint of nature and the cosmos, similarly applied to, just as it did the rest of nature. And so what happens as we begin advancing, so to say, is that those two realms of meaning and what happens to us and the human grow increasingly apart. So the world of meaning, rather than being out there in the world and in here, it becomes more that we are generators of meaning. Our perception, as it becomes more atomized, more individualized, more separated from nature, it becomes more in our own heads, right? It becomes more in our own perceptions. And think about this, as societies become more diverse and, more and more and more syncretization and clashes between different religious and philosophical fields happen. I mean, of course, this philosophy is bound to happen. We're bound to see each other more as separate. We're bound to encounter different worldviews that make us believe, people must see the world a lot differently, head to head, body to body. And so the perception of kind of separation from the greater cosmos or nature sets in. Now, what he says happens in the early modern period and really the scientific revolutions is that meaning it is like we're not even in the realm of our own meanings anymore. There is no meaning, right? So the little dot of meaning that used to color everything that then went in here, it's like not even there anymore, right? It's out there. We can go out and we can sort of, follow a cultural trend or create our own meaning or use the meanings given to us by society to kind of construct our own. And that would be kind of the postmodern world we're living in, is there's no meaning, there's no intrinsic truth to anything. Things happen because of purely material causes that we can rationally prove and explain, which kind of sets up this idea that we are in charge of everything in our lives that happens to us, right? For reasoning it, for figuring it out, for explaining it. And time again, what I am shown, at least, is that we cannot, we cannot rationally explain everything that happens to us. And meaning, the more that we live our life, there are these patterns, there are these cycles, there are things that for every single life, whether it's individual or societal, if you're looking at the chart of a society, there are patterns that ebb and flow through our life. And so my belief is that astrology is impossibly a universal thing. I mean, astrology could never be. Astrology is a limited cultural set of images, of symbols, of archetypes that, they didn't have in Papua New Guinea. They didn't have in Maori society. They didn't have in, the Native American world. Astrology is a purely Mediterranean phenomenon as we practice it today. It is culturally bound by the myths and stories and philosophies of that part of the world. However, in this way, I think that rather being a doctrine or a dogma or a religion or an absolute truth, like if something's in Pisces, this is going to happen, it is a language, astrology. We can use it as a language for describing the indescribable. We can use it as a language for describing our lives, the unfolding of our lives. It is a heuristical tool rather than a dogma for arriving at different, I don't want to say conclusions, but different explanations for life. And so, how I see the cosmos is that they are, in a way, impersonal, but that we can build a personal relationship to them. We can bridge a relationship to them through this language of astrology, because I do believe on some level, these cycles and the cycle of life is fated and is very out of our control. Now, by fated, that suggests, I don't know, everything happens for a reason. I don't believe that at all. I believe that things happen and then we give them a reason, right? So things happen. And astrology can be one of those reasons. But do I believe we have control over a ton that happens to us? Absolutely not. And that's why I do really love astrology, is because it's a language for describing things that are outside of our control. Now, I do not believe astrology should be an exclusive language for describing that. I think that we need to, just as much as a metaphysical perspective, have a physical and a materialist perspective. If anything, I'm a huge advocate for the use of the rational senses and the intellect and reason. I think that's extremely important. But I also think that there are some things that reason and the intellect and the rational models we've devised for how society should run just do not work. I think there is a greater mystery to it all that astrology, much like dream work or much like tarot, can help us engage with. I think right now in the world, we are so missing that. I think we have become so obsessed with this idea of control, that humans can control everything, that we can know everything, that we can fight and know exactly for what we want. And I believe that we need a language like astrology or like tarot or like divination or like dream work to help us engage with the nuances and complexities and what you might call the unconscious, what others might call just trying to figure life out, right? Like we need these tools to be able to engage those mysteries, to kind of humble ourselves, right? Like those first early humans who were humbled by nature, who were humbled by these bigger powers, which they sort of had relations with rather than were trying to gain conquest over. And I truly feel that way with the cosmos or with tarot. I feel that sense of, what did Rudolph Otto call it? Mysterium tremendum. These tools that seem to have this power and this resonance allow me to sort of sit back, humble my ego, humble my need for control, and sort of submit to whatever surfaces, right? Whatever surfaces in my astrological birth chart, whatever surfaces in my cards that day. It's like I can just sit back and go, okay, right? And it doesn't mean that the meaning of those cards is absolute, right? Is going to guide everything I do in my life, but it at least allows me to get out of my own way, to decenter myself and to center something more divine. And I think that's where we've gone really off track as a human world, is that in our constant need to be rational, to be reasonable, to be individuals, we have lost some connection with the greater mystery of how it all works, with the greater forces of nature that we're living amidst. And I really think astrology is a language for getting us back into relation with those greater powers. One of the reasons I found astrology, a little bit of my life story, is I used to be, I wouldn't have known this language at the time, but I used to be really a free will absolutist. I was a person obsessed with controlling every aspect of my life, my career, my destiny, everything. And what I found is after being an extremely hard worker, trying everything I could to get in the doors in the film industry where I used to, apply a lot of energy. When you try so hard, when you reason and rationale so much and it's still not working, what do? You can't look to yourself, right? You can't just look to Ethan's brain. I have to look to nature's brain. I have to get acquainted with a flow and a rhythm that underlies my life, that underlies my conscious mind and might live in my unconscious mind, right? Or might live in the cosmos. And so really, when I could not make sense of the world through reason anymore, I went to find out about the less reasonable, the less rational, the more magical. And I think it is very important that we have one foot on land and one foot in water, astrology being the water, right? Like we have to be grounded in this world. We have to be grounded in reason and we should practice rationality, but we cannot keep the ground sustained. We cannot keep the ground nourished if we don't have water, if we don't have dreams, imagination, myth. I think that the two should not have to be mutually exclusive. I think that they should exist together and feed each other, right? Because the more that we stay on land, it's like I felt my own unconscious, my own water dying, like dying to be drunken from, dying to be engaged with. Because when we live so up here in our heads, it's like you can just feel it in your day. You can feel the clock ticking. You can feel every moment, just going by, and you're not able to flow. You're not able to just feel, in the hands of something greater. So rather than being an end all be all of how to live your life, astrology is a bridge to living, I think, more in tandem with something greater. And for describing what that is through the limited human vocabulary we have for archetypes. And I am one who I guess you could say practices astrology in a postmodern sense, where I believe that, everyone should be free to use this language however they wish. I can't claim a universal truth. I can't even claim that there are powers higher. But what I can say is that this language can be used really any way you want it. And the way that I choose to use it is in terms of healing and recovery and transformation. And the reason I think it works for healing, recovery, and transformation is because all of those things are about dying to yourself, dying to what's in your head, and trusting in something greater, trusting or engaging with something that goes beyond your own limited understanding. And astrology can really do that. And I think astrology should be questioned. And we should not just take the bait of what the internet tells us our charts are. I think we should engage with astrology. The more that we engage with astrology, the more that we challenge it, the more that we ask questions of it, I think it's the space where we receive the astrology and we process the astrology that we become who we're meant to be. Right? By having the astrological information, it's not just putting that in your brain that makes you into who you're meant to be. It's in problematizing it. It's in questioning it. It's in feeling into it. And it's through this information that there's some friction that gets us to bloom, that gets us to become who we want to be. And if you believe in the postmodern sentiment that we're always creating ourselves, astrology is a great tool. It's a great paint in your paint kit for coloring yourself in. So that was a very long episode. I feel like convoluted in some parts, but maybe you learned something about philosophy. Maybe you're able to consider, your own astrological philosophy in a new way. I hope it was entertaining. I hope it helped. I had a ball talking about it, so hopefully you have a ball watching it. And I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.